You wrote about NVIDIA's upcoming conference in your newsletter as well this week. GTC is coming up, and you wrote about a new chip that they could be unveiling with Groq. What do we know about that?
Right. So next week, a bunch of us of the information are heading down for NVIDIA's GTC conference. And one thing that we're hearing across the board is that NVIDIA will be announcing a new type of chip that will combine a Groq chip with an NVIDIA chip. And everyone's very curious to hear, some more of the specifics. The Wall Street Journal has reported on this chip, and that OpenAI might be a large customer of the new chip. But it'll be really interesting to see how Jensen Huang, plays this chip, into NVIDIA's strategy, because essentially what they're going to be saying is that, hey, this non-NVIDIA chip actually works really well with NVIDIA chips. Obviously, NVIDIA sort of acqui-hired Groq last year in a large deal. But, in announcing a chip so quickly with another company's technology, I think it's going to, be very exciting for other chip companies who kind of view this as a sign that GPUs might not always be the number one chip for all AI workloads.
Now, we've talked on the show about how inferencing is going to be so much more important in terms of the workloads that these chips can handle. But if you just sort of simplify things for us, I mean, what sorts of tasks would this chip be better at? Would the Groq chip help NVIDIA deal with? I'm talking about what people actually will need to do with the AI.
So in terms of the workloads, what I'm hearing is that more complicated, intensive tasks such as coding might really benefit from this new NVIDIA Groq architecture. Don't have to get too into the weeds on the technical part of it, but basically there are some key functions as you're doing coding and other types of agentic work that you can offload from the GPU and potentially speed things up by a very large margin. So I'm expecting Jensen next week to have, a example of that, maybe a test of that on a coding product, and we think it's going to be OpenAI's.
Okay, now the last topic I want to discuss with you, because you had three topics in your newsletter today. You had the Oracle OpenAI build out, you had the Grok NVIDIA chip possibly coming, and then you had basically a third newsletter on
Sorry.
Google's TPU progress. Can you space them out for? I mean, like seriously, just come every day and we'll do one next time.
Yeah, that
But
might be easier. It was very, very packed with news this
Yeah,
week.
it reminds me of when all the companies decide to report quarterly results on the same day, and it's like you couldn't have coordinated. Anyway, 3 in 1, you talked about the TPUs, and the traction that they're getting, and we've already reported that, well, you've reported that Meta has a deal with Google to employ their TPUs. You paid attention to Broadcom's call last week, and you pointed out something in the news that I thought was interesting about how much traction it's getting. What did you find?
So last week on Broadcom's earnings call, and now Broadcom co-designs Google's TPU, so that's why it is relevant. Um, CEO Hock Tan talked about demand for TPUs skyrocketing in the coming years. And I thought it was interesting that he specifically called out Anthropic. He said Anthropic is set to have a gigawatt of TPUs in 2026, and potentially next year they could have 3 gigawatts. So that expansion is not an order yet, but he's clearly telling investors that he has a line of sight into Anthropic, you know, in a very big way, increasing its TPU usage. And most people rent TPUs from Google Cloud if they do use them. But Anthropic has kind of pioneered this new model with Google where it is actually buying the hardware and then putting the chips into data centers that it has more control of. So I was very interested in that disclosure from Broadcom last week that this TPU deal that we saw with Anthropic and Broadcom last year, where Anthropic placed a $20 billion order, might not be the last one that we see.
And it's kind of interesting here because A Amazon too has talked up its partnership with Anthropic in terms of using its Trainium chip. And here we have Hock Tan who's talking up Anthropic's use of the TPUs. And I have to say, I haven't heard as much from OpenAI doing some of the. I mean, they've done a deal with AMD. Again, I'm going back to the matrix that you've published. Who has a deal with whom, but
It's hard.
Anthropic seems to be very much diversifying its bet here with the chips. The other interesting part, though, that you had this line, and maybe this helps explain it. You said, We believe Tan's number reflects the TPUs the cloud maker buys directly from Broadcom. So counting additional TPUs it rents from Google Cloud would push that wattage even higher. The point you're making basically is that the TPU usage is going to increase based on all this.
Exactly, and then the interesting thing about Anthropic is that, it is decided to buy TPUs, in a large way, which is not typically how people access TPUs. So, you know, OpenAI, for example, we haven't heard of them necessarily buying Amazon's chip and like buying their own infrastructure, whereas Anthropic has figured out a way to structure it where they're not just renting TPUs from Google anymore. They're going to put them in data centers that they have more control over, which is pretty interesting. It just shows that they are big fans of the chip, and that's definitely a bigger commitment than renting.
Now, the last question for you here is on the topic of Fluidstack. Fluidstack is a company that you highlighted in the newsletter today. What do they do, and what have we found about them?
So Fluidstack is a key partner that Google has as it tries to get more companies to, like I just mentioned, buy TPUs and operate them in data centers. It sort of came out of nowhere, I would say, last year when Fluidstack was involved in these Anthropic TPU deals with Google. And so, what we know about Fluidstack is that they are selling some sort of software layer to Anthropic that apparently helps them manage their GPU clusters better than they would if they didn't have this software from Fluidstack. And what we found out about Fluidstack and what's in the newsletter is that Fluidstack is telling investors that not only is it selling its software to Anthropic, but it is hoping in the coming months to actually win some Google internal workloads and help Google expand its TPU capacity for itself. And Fluidstack is also in talks to potentially raise another round of venture capital, which would be surprising since they just raised a couple hundred million a few weeks ago. So Fluidstock we're definitely watching as a proxy for demand on TPUs, but how they fit into the bigger picture long term is still a little bit unclear to me.
Great. Well, Anissa, I want to thank you for coming on. There was a lot there, and I think the story that I'm actually watching for is the Oracle TPU tie up of some kind, just combining everything we've talked about. I mean that's not a combination on the matrix I think we've seen in great detail yet, but I certainly think that it's coming. So I'm excited to watch for it. That is Anissa Gardizy, our cloud and compute reporter here at The Information.